So let's start with example 1, production of hydrogen by PEM water electrolysis. And the reason why I chose this example was because I wanted to give you a concrete example of how you could actually produce hydrogen using electrolysis of water, because we talked about this last term when we study hydrogen as a potential fuels alternatives. Remember that there are two methods to produce hydrogen gas. The first one is steam reforming of methane, and you do need to memorize the equations for that. And the second way is electrolysis of water, which is the more expensive method. So it's not really widely used yet. And the reason why we actually want to produce hydrogen gas is because you can use it in a hydrogen fuel cell. So a very good question in the exam or even in the SAC would be to combine the two. So you have a hydrogen fuel cells and then you have the electrolysis of water to produce hydrogen. Because one of the things that we really want to assess is your ability to connect between different topics in chemistry, and to connect between galvanic redox and electrolytic redox is not even that big of a connection that you had to make. So whenever you see a question, you're going to have a diagram such as this one, and this one looks really similar to a fuel cell, but it is not a fuel cell because there is a power supply here, so that's how you know it's electrolysis even without a title. But it is a PEM water electrolysis. There is a PEM fuel cell, maybe that's another reason why it looks really similar, and you're going to get some extra information as well. So the information given here tells you that the electrodes are inert, so you probably don't have to worry about them. They're potentially some catalytic or inert electrodes, which is the norm in any water electrolysis, I think. But they actually have to give you some information on what the electrolyte is and what PEM means. So PEM stands for proton exchange membrane. So it is a solid membrane that only permits protons or H plus ions to pass through, and it separates the cell into two half cells. So very interesting, because you actually have separation of the cathode chamber and the anode chamber, even though this is not a galvanic cell, and separation of reactants are not required because they're not going to react spontaneously anyway. So we're going to explain why in a bit. The other thing is the electrolyte is solid, so you actually can't use the electrolyte to predict what products will be formed. So this is the PEM, and it allows hydrogen ions to go through. So you can still consider it to be an electrolyte, even though it is a solid, because the definition of an electrolyte is just something that conducts electricity in the sense that it allows ions to pass through. You're going to see a lot of solid electrolytes in some of the more difficult examples. The type of cell, you could, I think, consider this to be this type of cell, which is the majority of the examples that we looked at last lesson. So you're using an inert electrode or two inert electrodes. There is an aqueous electrolyte. Well, there is water. Technically speaking, the electrolyte is solid, but there is water present. And it's not under any extreme condition in the sense that, well, the information doesn't tell me that it's under 1500 Celsius degree or anything. So I'm just going to assume that it's non-extreme. I will talk to you about this non-SLC condition in the next example. So because somebody asked me what this actually looks like when I taught fuel cells, I figure I gave you a visual image. I found this on the internet. So this is the catalyst plate. So you're actually going to have one catalyst plate for the cathode and one for the anode, depending on how much money you have. But you can see that the electrodes are porous in this case because there's some gas being produced. We'll talk about that in a second. So this is what I mean by porous electrodes. It's actually a lot bigger than I thought. And number 3 is the actual membrane, also very, very thin. I mean, the pores are bigger than what I thought, but everything seems to be very thin. So you can stack them quite tightly together, and you probably need one more catalyst plate for the anode here. The interesting thing when I was reading that journal article is they said that the cost of the catalyst plates account for about 48% of the cost of the cell. So they're very, very expensive, tend to be made of something like platinum. And then the membrane is like another 24%. So almost most of the cost of the cell, like 3/4, it's just these two plates. But anyway, I guess that's one of the reasons why water electrolysis is not widely used yet, because it's fairly expensive. I mean, I'm just saying these two account for the majority of the cost of the cell. It doesn't necessarily mean that the cell is expensive, but it is. Okay, let's start with what is the purpose of the cell. This is very simple. It's already given to you in the title. So the purpose is to produce hydrogen gas. By the way, I do want to point out that whenever we say production of hydrogen, we're referring to hydrogen gas because hydrogen is a diatomic element, so it doesn't exist as just one single atom of hydrogen. It's always H2. So please do not say H or write H in your answer. It's H2. Okay, hydrogen gas is H2. If I want, there is no hydrogen by itself. Like the only time when hydrogen is by itself is in the form of protons, which is H plus. So it's not even H. So that's the purpose of the cell. The second thing we're going to look at is how does a cell operate. So let's just start by identifying the cathode, the anode, and the electrolyte. So these are the electrodes, and if you remember to panic, I'm going to try to use this acronym more. Panic means positive anode, so the anode is here. The anode is the positive electrode, and negative cathode. So the cathode is here, it is the negative electrode. And the electrolyte, as mentioned by the information given earlier, is just the proton exchange membrane here. So this is the electrolyte. Next step is to write the half equations. Now, if you remember from our previous videos, in order to write half equations for electrolysis and in order to determine the products that can be formed, you need to look at the species present and then use electrochemical series. You're not going to be able to consider the components of the electrolyte because it is a solid, and if they don't give you the chemical composition, it probably is an indication that you're not going to use it. The electrodes are already inert, so we can't consider them. The only thing that you have left, according to this diagram, is the water. So there is some water coming in and come into contact with the anode. Notice how there isn't any water being drawn on this side, so it doesn't look like the water gets to the cathode even, so it's just the anode. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to consider water as a reducing agent, and well, there are two, but I'm just going to go with this one because this is a stronger reducing agent. So at the anode, what you're going to get is you're going to get water being oxidized to oxygen gas, and you're going to produce some hydrogen ions. So electrons are forcefully sucked out of the water, and the water turns into oxygen gas and hydrogen ions. So I think this explains why there is an outgoing arrow here, and there will be some hydrogen ions that are produced, and they're just going to be somewhere here. Okay, so I actually don't have anything on this side to actually consider reduction yet, so this is very interesting so far. But let's think about the flow of ions first. Remember that the PEM, which is proton exchange membrane, allows ions to go through. And also, if you watch the introduction video, I've mentioned that cations will go towards the cathode. So if you have hydrogen ions that are produced here, in order to prevent a buildup of hydrogen ions on this side, the hydrogen ions will cross the electrolyte and go towards the cathode. Based on the information given, you should be able to make that deduction. And if there is hydrogen ions on this side, you probably can consider hydrogen ions as a reduced oxidizing agent and see what it's going to do, because hydrogen ions can act as an oxidizing agent. So the hydrogen ions will cross the electrolyte to the cathode and undergoes reduction there. So you're going to have this, and this is very good because this is actually how your hydrogen gas, which is the purpose of this cell, is produced. So this is good because hydrogen ions are produced at the anode, and then they can cross the membrane and then get consumed at the cathode. So you don't have a buildup of positively charged ions. They just keep going on the other side. So you have flow of ions, which is good. And the hydrogen gas, I think, comes out here. So this cell is very, very interesting in the sense that oxidation and reduction don't occur simultaneously. You need oxidation to happen first to produce some ion, and that ion becomes used in here. And this only applies to this particular design. You can have another design when you start off with water on both sides, and that will change the equations that you will write, just so you know. The last thing you need to do is to describe the collection of materials. So I think you can clearly see here the products are hydrogen gas and oxygen gas, and they are collected or they come out from different output channels, if you will, and you can have like an actual tank to collect them. So H2 gas. So oxygen gas is going to be considered a byproduct in this case, so it's not the sole purpose for the cell's existence, but it is a useful product that you can collect as well. So it is a byproduct. So H2 gas, and the difference between a byproduct and the actual main product is if you can't get the byproduct, so if you do something to the cell and it means that you can no longer collect a byproduct or you can no longer produce a byproduct, that shouldn't be as detrimental because it's just something, oh, if you can get it, that's fine. So that's probably the main difference. Whereas if you do something to the cell and you can no longer produce hydrogen gas, that now we have an issue because that's the whole point. So hydrogen gas and oxygen gas are collected separately. And it is very important because hydrogen is highly flammable. Kind of don't want it to be near oxygen. I explain that in more details in the next slide. But let's just say that's the collection of materials because there isn't any collection tank being drawn on this diagram. So I probably can assume and potentially they will go into different collection tanks, but you don't have any information to actually say that. All right, I found this diagram on the internet. Is it GIF or GIF? One of those. You're not going to see this in the SAP, obviously. Definitely not in the exam because we can't really animate. I mean, it pops out of this page. That'd be good. It is the future. But you can actually see flow of things really well. So this one's quite nice. It actually tells you that the energy for the cell is from the sun. So there's a solar panel here. The anode is here. So there is a water tank coming in, and the water, it's going to, let's just follow this water. So the water coming in, and actually it's right here. I think this is really misleading, but the anode should actually be here. This is what happened when you use diagram from Wikipedia. So the water goes towards the anode and it gets oxidized, and the hydrogen gas go across the membrane, whereas the oxygen gas come out. So that should be the cathode. Why you do that? I should write a Wikipedia. I have too many things to do. I'm not doing that. Okay, so oh, electrons coming in here, the hydrogens are reduced to hydrogen gas and get collected. Okay, so there you go. Lastly, let's talk about what is the function of each component of the cell. So the question that people can ask, and I mean, I haven't seen a question when they say what is the function of an electrode, but I feel like we should ask that question at one point because students cannot answer properly. So electrodes, the function of an electrode is to provide the size for electron transfer, either the side for the gaining of electrons or the losing of electrons. The electrolyte or the PEM is probably the unique feature here. And so I can ask the question, what is the function of the PEM? Because the cell is called a PEM water electrolysis. The PEM seems to be something that I probably should ask. Now, just like any other electrolyte, the PEM would allow for flow of hydrogen ions. So the purpose of an electrolyte is to allow for flow of ions so that there isn't a buildup. However, when you answer this question, if I asked you, what is the function of the PEM? Your goal is to be as specific to the context that you are discussing as possible. So I don't want you to just say, allow ions to flow. I want you to tell me which ion, in this case hydrogen ions, and where is it going. So allow for the flow of hydrogen. Please write the charge correctly, H plus ions from the anode to the cathode. In some other situations, it may be another ion and it may be going from the cathode to the anode. So you want to be as specific as you can because that's how you show that you understand the context, which is how you get full marks in these questions, showing an understanding of the context. So don't just say things in general and then wonder why you don't get full marks. Now, the second function of the electrolyte here is to separate the cathode from the anode. And I mentioned earlier in a previous video that you don't actually need to separate the reactants of electrolysis because they don't react spontaneously with each other. However, you do have to separate the products of electrolysis. Because if you look at the two products, no, I didn't do that. Okay, so the two products of electrolysis, which is oxygen and hydrogen, they can form a backward Z. So the two products of any electrolytic process really will react spontaneously with each other. So if I don't have some strategy in the cell to separate the oxygen gas from the hydrogen gas, if they come into contact, they will just produce water again, and that would defeat the purpose of the cell. So whenever you see an actual electrolytic cell, there will be some strategies to separate the products of electrolysis so that they don't come into contact with each other. Because if they do, they will react spontaneously with each other and you no longer get your product. Furthermore, in this particular case, hydrogen gas is highly flammable. So, and the reaction between oxygen and hydrogen in direct contact is also exothermic. So you may get an explosion. You probably don't want that in your electrolytic plant. Um, because you should know how dangerous hydrogen is. That would be a question that they can ask as well. Anyway, just to recap, I think the main point I want to make using this particular example is that you need to have some strategies in the electrolytic cells to separate the products of electrolysis from directly coming into contact with each other to prevent a spontaneous reaction. That's probably the main unique feature that is different from this cell and all the other examples that we looked at. I think that's it for example 1.